During and after the Civil War, as I said in a previous lecture, the Supreme Court is not leading on issues. During the Civil War, the federal government is engaged in a fight for its life against the Confederate government. And after the Civil War, the U.S. Congress, led by radical Republicans, are trying to reprogram the basic values of the Southern states by force during the time of military occupation of the South as a defeated country. Once those troops are pulled out, the flimsiness of this Reconstruction effort is revealed as the people elect a bunch of Jim Crow politicians and establish a bunch of Jim Crow laws designed to keep blacks in a subservient role, regardless of the local population figures. They may be officially citizens of the United States, but they are not granted the rights and responsibilities of those of real citizens. Munn versus Illinois, 1877, is during an otherwise reasonably quiet time in Supreme Court history. The states are basically given the right to regulate certain private industries for the public good. I'll say that again. The states, according to Munn versus Illinois, are allowed to regulate private industry to a degree for the public good, whatever that means. And again, as a conservative and as a believer in judicial restraint, not judicial activism, it's really not happy making for me to talk about this, but the contention of the Supreme Court was that public good is part of government's job to bring about public good, not just to stop public evil. Again, we come to one of the more notorious and nasty decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court in modern eyes, and that is the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision. In 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson, the U.S. Supreme Court approves the doctrine of separate but equal. You can have black elementary school, white elementary school. You can segregate to a black bathroom and a white bathroom. You can have black rules on the bus where only black people can sit, and white rules on the bus where only white people can sit. The same thing at lunch counters, as long as the accommodations are equal. So very often what happens is you get this beautiful public water fountain that people would drink from for whites only, and it'll say no coloreds or whites only. And then you'll have like a pipe sticking out of a wall that you can screw open and pour some rusty water in, and that's the separate but equal water fountain for coloreds or blacks or Negroes only. Depending upon the era, they use different terms. So Plessy v. Ferguson sets up and basically legitimizes a set of schools for blacks and facilities and accommodations for blacks that are supposedly separate from white but equal, but they're not. And any fair observer will point out that separate but equal is never equal. It also gives people different rights under the Constitution based on race, which is, again, in modern eyes, extremely bad. Now we come to Weeks versus the United States. And what we have here is a case where evidence is gathered by happenstance for a crime. Now, the evidence is gathered by the police. The police were there for another reason, but they happened to gather evidence for other crimes, and so Weeks is brought in. The court decides, in, I believe, a unanimous decision, that evidence that is obtained fraudulently, without a search warrant, without probable cause or reasonable suspicion, when basically the police go on a fishing expedition until they find something incriminating and then they charge you, that is absolutely a no-no. It is a major violation of Fourth Amendment rights, or basically of Americans' civil rights in general terms. No. Weeks v. United States says, no, you may not use tainted evidence, evidence obtained by the police unlawfully in court to convict someone. No, 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 no. Now we go to Buck versus Bell in 1927. Buck versus Bell is a decision involving the feeble-minded, is the term they use at that time. What we would call developmentally disabled or mentally retarded people in more modern language. You have a case of, quote, feeble-minded mothers giving birth to feeble-minded children. And the question is, can public health doctors and doctors in institutions and public safety officials in general mandate that people who are feeble-minded be forcibly sterilized? In other words, like you spay or neuter an animal, you find a person who has a lower IQ, who is not functioning normally in society, whatever that means, and you decide that they need to be prevented from ever having children, rather than having abortions after the fact or executing criminals. And this is actually said in the court decision. Rather than letting the feeble-minded grow and having to execute them after they've harmed people and committed crimes, better to prevent them from ever being born. This is at a time in 1927 when the idea of eugenics, of purpose breeding human beings, is fashionable. It took World War II to make that idea somewhat less fashionable. So, Buck versus Bell, 1927. You may forcibly sterilize the feeble-minded, and that goes through up through other decisions made in the Warren Court era of the 1960s. Neer versus Minnesota, 1931. And I do have to look these up because I am primarily a history teacher, and civics is something I have to study on. Neer versus Minnesota involved a gag order against journalists reporting on certain things that were politically sensitive to a group of local judges. And the local newspaper didn't play ball, and the result was that they were taken to court. The U.S. Supreme Court, I also believe in a unanimous decision, and that's important because that means the people of all political views go along with this decision. They say that, no, a gag order in a case like this is unconstitutional. It violates the First Amendment, freedom of the press, and you really need to scale a pretty high mountain of justification before you can try, as a politician or a judge, to deem certain speech to be unlawful. Our freedom of speech is a very broad freedom and should not be messed with by self-serving little politicians who want to stifle dissent. Now we come to Wickard versus Filbert in the height of World War II, 1942. 1942, when you take my modern history class, European history class, God willing, is the turning point year of World War II. And it's not really apparent until after 42 that it is a turning point. Before 1942 and through 1942, the Axis powers tended to be winning. The Axis powers are Imperial Japan in the Pacific, Fascist Italy in the Mediterranean, and National Socialist Germany in Europe and Russia. And we were brought into the war by a sneak attack on our Navy base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, which was a U.S. territory at that time. Over 3,000 Americans were murdered by the Japanese in an unprovoked attack, which did not follow a declaration of war. There's a whole story behind that. But basically, it was a sneak attack, and we thought we were at peace, and suddenly our ships are being sunk. The idea that we might lose World War II was very, very real. And so a question comes, does the federal government have the right to control the production of wheat? Does the federal government have a right to restrict the amount of wheat that's going to be grown to prevent it from being on the market and lowering the overall price of wheat. The federal government during the war and during the Depression before it is engaged in a lot of economic interference that the Roosevelt administration, the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration, says is for the greater good and during the war for victory. So the U.S. Supreme Court signs on to this. And in doing so, they grant the American federal government vast powers to interfere with the economy during times of national emergency. Not that that's at all familiar to what we're going through now with coronavirus, Chinese Communist Party, flu, or whatever you want to call it. I know what I like to call it. Now, next time, the war in court.